Awesome. So hi guys. So we're super excited to be doing our 4th Women in Fencing webinar with some super inspiring and accomplished panelists. So we would like to thank all of our panelists for attending and everyone in the audience for watching. So in our previous panels, we talked about a few different topics, including the inclusion of women in fencing, struggles that were faced by women athletes, and then also diversity. So today we're going to focus on how to get more women in decision-making positions and be more inclusive in fencing. And our panelists are going to share their stories and struggles to start the dialogue. And we're just going to talk about how we can make the future brighter for everyone. We hope these insights inspire all of you to get involved and strive to reduce bias and fix the underrepresentation of women in our sport. So today we're just going to start with introductions, and then we're going to have some questions about our panelists' journeys, and then a couple questions that we selected from the audience. So we'll just start with the intros really quick, and we have a quick PowerPoint to share with you guys. Okay. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, awesome. Okay, so our first amazing panelist is Coach Anthony. He's the head coach of Ohio State, which is a Div 1 college fencing program. He was the chairman and president of USA Fencing from 2012 to 2020. He's the vice president and executive committee member of FIE, and he's a member of Team USA. Okay, our next amazing panelist is Kris Ekeren. She's the CEO of USA Fencing. She's also the vice president of the National Sports Center for the Disabled, and then the vice chair of the Association of Chief Executives of Sport. Our next amazing panelist is Coach Cody. He's the president of the USA Fencing Coaching Association. He was the 2012 Team World Champion. He's the vice president of the USA Fencing Board from 2016 to 2020. He's an Olympian from Team USA and the Epee program director of Northwest Fencing Center. Our next awesome panelist is Coach Damien. He's a U.S. Olympic pentathlon coach. He's also the coach at Richmond Fencing Club. He has a blog called The Fencing Coach, where he uses social media to like as an influencer in really positive ways. Our next awesome panelist is Natalie. She's on number 4 in U.S. Women's Epee. She's ranked 5th in Women's Epee. She's the U.S. Olympic Committee Community Development Program, and she's a coach at LAIFC. Just a quick intro for myself. I'm Ketki. I'm going to be moderating this panel, and then you can just see some of my accomplishments below. I'm Mallika. You can also see some of my accomplishments below, and I'm also going to be moderating. So yeah. Thank you. Okay. So stop sharing, and then we'll start off with the questions. Okay. So Coach Anthony, we would like to start with you. So you were the president of USA Fencing for 8 years, and we're sure a lot of things changed since when you started. So during your time at USA Fencing, did you sort of undertake any initiatives to get more inclusion and more women in fencing? And did you observe a positive change for these initiatives?
Yeah, well, thank you first of all for allowing me to participate in your panel, and congratulations on the great work that you guys are doing. It's a really good initiative. I also want to congratulate Cody as the new president of the Coaches Association, and look forward to see what he's going to do there, because he's been a power in the sport for a very long time. So keep up the great work, Cody. From the standpoint of USA Fencing, you know, I would say that, you know, the first change that we took on was as far as empowering women would be, you know, our CEO, who is on this call. Kris Ekeren has been CEO for 7 years. You know, I would say another major change in the organizational structure as far as positions of power would also be the high performance director, Kate Reisinger. I think both of those were major, you know, changes. The other would be independent directors. You know, we've had a female independent director, and Kel Brown. She's just coming off the board, brought both a female as well as a diverse background as far as ethnicity. And then I would say the other piece was representation on the Fie Commissions and Councils. I think we had a pretty good run there as far as, really having women in, strategic powers with, Stacey Johnson, the past president, being president of the Women's Council. And also Yana Dakova being, on the arbitrage. Arbitrage is a hugely powerful commission, second probably only to the executive committee, and having a female representative from the U.S. Was an important part of that as well. And then, we go back internally, over these years, we've got Kathy, Walker as part of the, the Semi Commission has been, a diverse person there, and really moving from the standpoint of, and that's leadership, just really moving into those areas. So I would say those are the big things that, and then as far as, initiatives, is really trying to create an environment where women can, feel as though that the access is there, and then creating an environment where they can actually feel able to do what they're capable of, and encouraging them. And, at times just really creating an environment where they feel as though it's a safe zone, so that they are not limited to what people may say they should do, but what they're truly capable of doing. Those are the kinds of things that I think, we've done from that standpoint. And then the last piece is once creating a culture where women feel as though that, they are able to, to thrive. And a lot of that is getting through, some of the things we'll touch on later from an implicit bias standpoint, where people don't know the culture of, a male domination, which is historically, is dominant in our sport. I mean, we've seen our sport transition. So I think all of that is part of, what we've been able to do over an 8-year period, and I think we'll continue to move forward with.
Thank you so much, Coach Anthony. So our next question is for Coach Cody. So we know that you were vice president with Coach Anthony, and both of you have worked for a couple of years together. So now that you're the president of the USA Fencing Coaching Association, do you plan to use your experience from your previous role to help promote women coaches, women referees?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it was, I learned a lot working with Don when he was president for 8 years, and there was a lot of success during that period as an organization, and on the inclusion side for sure. And one of the things I would say has been a very interesting transition from working with the U.S. Fencing Board of Directors and now with the United States Coaching Association is trying to bring representation up. Some of my other roles with the Olympic Committee also were, trying to bring up representation within the Paralympic community, which was underrepresented. And in the same way with the Coaching Association, we're seeing kind of some of the same things. And so since I became the president of the Coaching Association, we've been looking into kind of the succession planning. I think when you have an organization, succession planning is really important, and you need to think things through ahead of time. And so I think you've had some panelists from W Fencing on in the past, and I've had some great conversations with some of the leaders from them. But in particular, there was a presentation from I think it was Molly Hill, and she was one of the founders of that document, and kind of looking at kind of recognizing what the numbers were. So I think just in seeing some of those figures was very eye-opening from representation of an organization, kind of looking at those numbers and taking that to heart as an organization. We looked at that and the tide scales of kind of women representation in my organization now with the Coaches Association, and we were frankly getting Fs from almost across the board in every committee structure we had. And sometimes you just have to look at those hard numbers and say that's not a good representation, and there's a lot of quality people out there that we could be including that are not, and why aren't we? So because of that, in the last few meetings that I've run with the organization, one of the things we've been doing is specifically calling out kind of where our representation is and where we want it to be. Since then, these kind of organizational changes can take time. I think it's really important for people to recognize that committees take time to transition and shift. Some positions are elected, and sometimes you need to, inspire people to run for those positions. So since I was on, we've already included one of our most important committees, which is our Certification and Accreditation Board, which sets the standards for coaching credentials. We have, for the first time ever, a woman who's the chair of that committee. Jen Oldham was elected the chair. And then when she was elected to the chair position, she was allowed to appoint 2 additional members to that panel of fencing masters. And that panel was only 1 of 8, and now it is 3 of 8 women. So not only is it the first ever chair to that committee, we now have 3 women in positions of authority on the Certification Accreditation Standards Board. So that's just one step that we're taking. I've started to basically holistically look across all of our committee structures and start planting that seed with our current chairs as we look to transition people off or on, to really have them start looking at saying, why aren't we having any women on these committees? What talents are you looking for? And already I started to see a lot of that implicit bias, like Don was talking about, where a lot of times it wasn't anything, nefarious or planned out, but they just hadn't considered it. There was a male-dominated presence in the sport and coaching, and they just didn't think about trying to find women coaches who had the same skill sets. And just having that conversation, we've already started identifying really good talent across the board, and we're moving in the right direction. And the final thing is really to create more positions and more coaches in general within the United States at a higher level on the education side, and in particular, really trying to inspire women to get involved as coaches in the sport.
Thank you, Coach Cody. I think it's really cool to see how things are already starting to change a little bit. So our next question is for Kris. So, since you're not a fencer, you must have a really different connection to USA Fencing than our other panelists. So how did you become sort of involved in USA Fencing?
Yeah, so I feel really fortunate that my career path has taken me to USA Fencing and the sport of fencing. Prior to joining the USA Fencing team and national office staff in 2011, I had worked in a variety of different sports and recreation positions, worked with nonprofits, worked with municipal agencies. And so when the opportunity came to work for USA Fencing, I jumped on it. I came on as the director of membership and really quickly just came to love the sport and the passion that you all have for participating. In 2013, I had the opportunity to serve as the interim executive director, and then in December of 2013 was chosen to be the executive director, CEO. I'm forever grateful to Don and Cody and those that were on the board at the time who gave me the opportunity to take the position. And I think that that's something that has been great for the sport of fencing. Obviously, for my professional development, it's been really, really good. I think one of the questions that I get all the time is, hey, were you a fencer? Were you a competitive fencer growing up? And it gives me the opportunity to share that, no, I wasn't, but I've really come to love the sport. And I also believe that some of the power of sport translates no matter what sport you come from. And so I think that how we can embrace that through fencing with confidence, teaching people how to win and lose and resilience. And so I think that's what I bring, is just that outside look at how great the sport is and how we can emphasize all of the things that the power of sport brings, particularly through fencing.
Thank you so much, Kris. So our next question is for Natalie. So we know that you're a fencer and then now you're also a coach. So you must have observed some changes and impacts of these initiatives and progress that has happened throughout the years. So what are your thoughts about these? And then do you think that we're headed in the right direction?
Thank you so much for having me on the panel. And yeah, so I've been taking some notes because there are a few things that, man, I want to say that as a women's epee fencer, when I started fencing, I was the only girl, the only woman in my entire fencing class to start fencing. And I know that my experience is not unique. All of the women's fencers and the girls fencers out there probably have had similar experiences where they were one of very few girls to start fencing, and I think the women that stay in fencing we're very special, because oftentimes we're in a class full of boys and we have to really fight. and that's something that a lot of us have in common. When I was born, women's epee was not even a sport. My sport was not even an Olympic sport. It was not included in the Olympics. And so that's actually huge to think about. Just within my lifetime, the sport that I compete in now was not even an Olympic sport. I think it's really important, just to backtrack a little bit on some of the conversations that we've been having about like women in positions of power. I think it's absolutely important that we start on a really grassroots level, getting more women involved in the sport, getting more girls involved in the sport. And that's also where we're going to see more women start to take on positions of power. Because right now, I think that me as a female, as a woman coach, I think it's really encouraging. I've noticed that the retention rate of my female students is much higher when I'm coaching a class or doing a summer camp. I think that as a women's fencer, I could have also really benefited from having a female coach, which I have never, ever had in the history of my entire career. So I think that that's something that I would really like to see us work on as an organization, is on a really grassroots level. How are we doing outreach to girls? How are we getting more girls to get involved in fencing? And also women of color, girls of color, like I am probably one of, especially in my fencing club. It's funny, the fencing club that I come from, the only other Latina to be on the US team actually came from my fencing club, from my coach in Phoenix, Arizona. That's 2 in the entire country, and so I think that that's some soul searching that as an organization, I think that we really need to do. And that's something that we really need to address, is how do we get more girls in general on a grassroots level to start getting involved in fencing, right? And especially girls and women of color. How do we start to address that? I think that as a fencing coach, I think it's imperative. I think that it's imperative that we have more women coaches. I know that I'm part of the Women's Sports Foundation, and that's something that we've observed actually since Title IX got enacted. For some strange reason, the number of women's coaches around the country has declined. And that's a problem that like no one really knows. Like why? When Title IX got enacted, why has the number of women's coaches in the country has gone down? And so that's something that I know the Women's Sports Foundation is actively trying to address. And it's probably, as Cody was saying, implicit bias. There's probably a lot of implicit bias when we're choosing, who's coaching which program, et cetera. There's probably some type of implicit bias that's, who are you going to pick for this position at the head of this position? And all of a sudden these positions become more competitive. And so, yeah, I think I'd really like to, that's something that I think is really important to address. Also, if we're talking about women in positions of power, is how do we get more women and girls on a very grassroots level involved in the sport? How do we increase the retention rate of these girls? And how do we start promoting our sport to more girls and make it more accessible to girls and to women of color?
Thank you, Natalie. I think it would be really awesome to see sort of initiatives going into place to get more girls into the sport. So our next question is for Coach Damien. So you play a very unique role. So can you share with us why and how you took on a role as a social media influencer?
Sure. First of all, Ketki and Mallika, I want to thank you very much for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. I love this quote from Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He said, in our society, the women who break down barriers are the ones that ignore limits. And you all organizing these panels, taking the initiative to do this, you're truly shattering the glass ceiling, helping to improve dialogue in our community and make it better. So thank you for having me. I'm very, very appreciative that you added me to this panel. I originally started my blog about 7 or 8 years ago, around the time of the London Olympics. It was started as this free resource to make information for parents, athletes, coaches a little bit more accessible to understand the nuances of fencing in our community. And I've written about 300 articles. It's been 7 years, still remains free. My priorities have shifted though. Our focus as a blog today is a lot less about why getting black carded is bad. We're sharing a lot less funny memes and things like that. We're really looking to see how we can amplify Black voices in our community and speak out on behalf of women who have been continually wronged in our sport with sexual assault, sexual harassment that are plaguing us and have often been swept under the rug, candidly. I'm grateful to have this platform, and I remain in awe of, the fencing coach team that we have that includes Dan Kellner, Hannah Provenza, Leland Gieman, Monica Examet, Anna Maria Liu. So our focus is really about how we can improve dialogue in our community and make the experience better for those who are disenfranchised.
Thank you, Coach Damien. It's really interesting to see how you can use social media to make like a really big and positive impact on the fencing community. So our next question, we're going to go back to Kris. So currently, out of the 55 national governing bodies for Olympic sports, only 4 of them are female CEOs. So in your opinion, what are the key hurdles or limiting factors for women becoming like in positions of power?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And so I think that it's not only in fencing or in sport, but it really is in society. And I think there are several pieces that we can all work together to increase those opportunities and women who are participating not only in sport, but in positions of power. So I think it's to make sure that we have the opportunities available. And I know some of the other panelists have already talked a little bit about that, making sure that we have coaches, that we have referees, that we have representation at all levels. So making sure that those opportunities present themselves. I think representation, very important. We've got to tell the story of those opportunities are out there and how do we get more women involved. I think panels like this are a really good opportunity for us to have open and honest discussions about where we're doing well and where we can go in the future. So I think that it's key. I think that both of you, by taking this on, kind of that next generation of women moving forward, I think we need to do a good job of storytelling. One of my favorite moments of this past week was getting to write Nikki Frank an email on the article that I had read about her. And what I shared with her was not only what a great and wonderful leader that she's been for the sport of fencing, but that she's passed it on. And so my favorite thing about that whole story was the fact that Nikki has 12 of her athletes have gone on to be coaches. And so I think that's how can we pass it on? So how can we nurture that next generation and move it forward? And I think that that's really key in those stories. I think the other piece that we've talked about is the grassroots level. And so how can we educate and empower our clubs and our local divisions to put in programs and best practices that are going to attract females and people of color to participate more in sport and nurture that sense of belonging. And I think that's key. And I think we can look at some of our clubs that are doing it really well. I know Cody has some success stories at Northwest. I think we can also look outside of our sport. Other sport that's a combat sport that's made great strides with female participation is wrestling. So what can we take that they have done well and translate that into fencing and make sure that we can educate everybody at the grassroots level. And I think it's important also to celebrate when we have some success in putting women in positions of power. And I know Don talked a little bit about the international influence, and he's done that really well in pushing USA Fencing forward. I think another thing to mention is that we had female chief of missions at our junior and cadet worlds with Seda Jacobson. We had Daria Schneider, who has been a team captain for our international team. So I think really celebrating some of those things along the way while recognizing that we have a lot of work left to do.
Thank you so much, Kris. So our next question is for Natalie. So why do you think that representation is important? And then as a woman and a woman of color, how important is representation to you?
Yeah, representation is huge. Representation matters. When you can see yourself in somebody else, they become your expander, and I feel like I've been lucky enough to have these amazing humans that have been my expander, both male, female, expanders of different colors, of different races, of different abilities in my lifetime. But to see someone who looks like you means that you can be there one day too, And in our society, you know, we really do have a stratified view of how we see ourselves and how we see others. And when we see someone that looks like us, that is a signal to us that one day we can reach and do what they're doing. And so I actually would challenge every coach here to start really nurturing some of the women or the top women in your club to become coaches, because I think that's really what's necessary, you know. And of course, I don't think that we can have a discussion of women in sports without discussing women of color in sports, right? And that's kind of one of the things about fencing that we have to address. You know, I started fencing in Phoenix. You guys know that I come from Phoenix, Arizona, and it's like from a little tiny fencing club. And my coach is from New York. His name is Raleigh Arroyo. And when he was a fencer in the 1950s, I think it was like the 1950s, when he was young, he was not allowed to go into the New York Athletic Club or the Fencers Club of New York. He was not allowed to physically, he's Puerto Rican, he wasn't allowed to go into those buildings. And so that is, to me, that is institutionalized racism, right? Now, on top of that, you not only have POC people, you not only have Black and Hispanic people that are not actually able to have access into the buildings, the very buildings where the top fencing is taking place. And then you have on top of that, you have women in sports, right? Where women's foil was a thing, but they were only allowed to go to 4 touches. They weren't even allowed to go to 5 touches, right? And that's already 2 strikes against you. And then take on top of that accessibility, right? The fact that fencing is actually, it's a pretty expensive sport. You know, there's a reason why you look at Olympic athletes and a lot of the Olympians that we see, there's a representation problem in American Olympians when it comes to race. You see that there is a lot of people of color are not actually being represented with the proportion that they are into the population, especially within the Latinx community and within the Native American community. And so that's something, those are parts of the puzzle that when we're talking about this, we have to talk about the whole piece, right? We can't talk about inclusion of women in sports without talking about women of color and people of color, and also that history, right? My very coach was denied access to some of the best fencing clubs in the United States, and who knows what an amazing fencer he could have been. But guess what? He ended up starting a fencing club where the only 2 Latino women in the United States came from this one tiny fencing club, right? The only 2 women's FAs that we've ever had that were Latina on the US team, they both come from the exact same club, right? So we can look at that and be like, okay, what's going on with that? Is it because their coach is also Latino? Is it because of the area where our club is? Because our club, Phoenix, and the area where our club is a very Latino dominated area. And so I think all of those questions are things that we have to look at almost as case studies, and to be like, all right, what's working in this case? Why is it working? And how can we use those examples to promote more women of color, more girls of color, make our sport more accessible? You know, accessibility of our sport is something that I am really passionate about, especially because when I started fencing on scholarship. My club that I started fencing at is a 501c3 nonprofit. And if it wasn't for that, I would not have started fencing. If it wasn't for my coach giving me free lessons, I would not have gotten to where I was as a fencer.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So our next question is for Coach Anthony. So how do you think that male athletes or coaches could help move gender issues forward? And then what impact can they make?
Well, I think sort of to the points that Natalie was just making, if you don't have the male coaches who are the dominant presence in our sport, being intentional about this objective, then you're not going to get the results that you need from a standpoint of moving it forward faster. Otherwise, you're constantly facing opposition. And to the point of accessibility, I think you have to have an open-mindedness about it. And first of all, you got to be aware. I mean, I've had a couple of conversations recently with very close friends of mine, who are, one was the captain of the team, my classmate, he was captain the year I graduated, talking about, was there any racism at Princeton? And, when you were there, because I don't see it social. I'm like, well, yeah, I felt it. He said, oh, and then I gave him some examples and he was like, oh. And then, the other is a friend who actually Kris and Cody both know, Eddie Moore, who's done some work for us, is reading the book Caste. And he was just saying that at being white male part of he was completely unaware of some of the things that you face as not part of the caste system, as they would say. So I think the awareness is the first side of it. And then I think the other side of it is really giving opportunities. When we talk about, really want to empower women, one of the first things that I was able to do, as a head coach was hire a female assistant coach, young, dynamic, more than capable, did not have the track record or experience as being a Div 1 assistant coach, but I knew that she was capable of that job because I knew her as a person. And when I listened to her, initially it was one of those, well, I'll do this because it's the right thing to do. But after I actually had a chance to really sit down with her, I'm like, no, this isn't just the right thing to do from that standpoint. This is the best thing to do because this is the best qualified person for this position. And it's made a huge difference back to the point of what Natalie was saying. When you see someone like you in these positions, it is empowering. It allows you to feel as though you are capable of moving forward. And I think that, that's probably, the most important thing and then the other thing, I'll go back, is creating an environment where that person knows that their voice is valued, that they can be heard, that they can be a leader in that, and that you empower them to lead if you are in, quote, a position of power, and know that their participation, and then also give people freedom to offer more accessibility. If we don't give people freedom if we don't say, look, not only do we want you to be proactive. And I think the last thing is, you promote the leadership, but we have to be intentional. I mean, it's not a matter of just saying, yeah, I'd like this to happen. It's a matter of saying, when I have an opportunity, am I really thinking about this in the standpoint of how do I move that ball forward? And that doesn't mean putting people who are not competent in positions where they're not capable of, but when the competency is there, when the fit is there, when the chemistry is there, then you can do that. And if you're in a cultural environment where the chemistry is not right, then it's up to you as a leader to start working on changing the chemistry of your culture so that that person can be successful.
Thank you so much, Coach Anthony. So our next question is for Coach Cody. So we all know about the POS Foundation, and it has really been instrumental in increasing diversity in our sport. So as a coach at a local club, what role would you like USA Fencing to play to support local clubs to sort of use that blueprint from the Peter Westbrook Foundation to increase diversity?
Yeah, I think it's a good and fair point. I think it's really kind of comes back to even after your point that Natalie was making with these clubs that are nonprofits. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations out there that have the opportunity to do things like Peter Westbrook. We're not going to all have as a dynamic a personality and leader as Peter Westbrook to potentially inspire such a major movement right off the bat, or have some of the kickstarts of Oprah Winfrey to help us along our way. But at the same time, it's a mission, it's a vision, and a value that you decide to go after. And there's lots of ways for our nonprofits clubs out there to do similar things. I know that the club that I work at, Northwest Fencing Center in Portland, Oregon, has been doing the same thing. Sometimes you have to say, look around you and say, I live in Portland, Oregon, which is a predominantly white community, and say, we don't have a lot of athletes of color. We don't have a lot of Black athletes in our club, not because we don't want them, but just, there just aren't as population-wise as many. But part of it is also saying, are you going out of your way to say, hey, are we trying to introduce it to those communities? Almost every pocket of the United States is a melting pot, and there are places where you can find different communities out there, and you just need to go and make those decisions to say, yes, we are going to try to find some of those community centers and bring this sport to them, and we're going to create opportunities like scholarships for some of those people to bring in them. Not only are they different races or genders, but also just economic. So being able to do that. Our new executive director of our club just created a new program to have a very fair and unbiased way of looking at that. Actually, what's pretty proud of what they did is that when you apply for a scholarship at our club now, you put in some of the economic data and things like that. but it's actually sent off to our accountant, our bookkeeper, who has no idea who you are. So even myself as a coach can't influence what's the selection of the grants and the scholarship. And so it really goes out to those who are in need. And that way there's no implicit bias at all. So we're trying to remove bias at all levels when we try to do our scholarship applications, and really make it a by need environment. And then also targeting certain communities that we know we're underrepresented in, and specifically going out there to create opportunities to say, we would like to have more diversity in our club. We would like to have more of those interactions and melting pot within our communities. And I think that that's something that any place in the U.S. can really look for and make that decision. And if that's something that U.S. Fencing as an organization can help identify local clubs, say, I want to have more inclusion, I want to have more athletes of color, are there organizations that you can help connect me in my local area? Or if that's something as simple as making that conscious decision to look for it, I think that the opportunities are out there for clubs around the country, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit, to do things like what Peter Westbrook Foundation has done to bring in new representation. The other side of that is the same thing, being able to specifically target things like women in fencing programs. We copied something that was women, I think it was for skating, skating for girls, like a roller skating or skateboarding clinics in the local area that were targeting just for women, and kind of being able to do the same thing and targeting fencing for girls programs and trying to bring up those things. But I think there's a lot of really important opportunities within models that we already have, and being able to figure out what those lessons they would learn is, and also what are those teachings. Talking to Peter Westbrook Foundation, saying, what were the biggest learnings you had as an organization as you came through that you would share with the community? Because I think there's a lot of organizations out there that would happily borrow the Peter Westbrook Foundation model and what they've done to be as successful as they were, and take their learning and make it their own.
Thank you so much, Coach Cody. Our next question is for Coach Damien. So in the previous question that we asked you, you talked a little bit about how you're using social media to kind of empower women. So could you talk a little bit more about that and any specific initiatives you have, and then any impact that you've seen?
Definitely. But before I get into answering that question, I just want to say among the panelists here, there seems to be an acknowledgement that we need more representation in fencing. I think I'm correct in making that assumption that we're all in alignment there. I would note that 35% of U.S. Fencing's membership are women, but only 6% of our licensed fencing masters who have achieved that certification are women. And so we have a little bit of a delta between our membership and the female coaches that are there. Natalie talked about that. So let's talk solutions here. Let's take it so anybody who gets the METRA certification, all fees are waived moving forward, and they're given complimentary USA Fencing lifetime status. I think at least giving that lifting that barrier, increasing our pipeline of women coaches, I think that's something that will move beyond acknowledgement and actually help get more of our women in fencing, women in the USA Fencing membership into coaching. Is that something, Cody, Kris, is that something that y'all would consider?
Well, I'll speak. I think we have to look at those kinds of solutions, Damien, and I don't speak for, I can't say automatically, but certainly it's something that Cody and I can work together on, and what can we do to increase those women in coaching.
Yeah, I know that right now, USFCA is working closely with the U.S. Fencing National Office to work on an integration plan to kind of bring the organizations closer together. And with the new leadership in our certification board, we're looking to make sure that we are making, especially the highest level barriers, come down as far as bringing more women to the highest level, our fencing master certification level, and how to recognize even just some of the greatest coaches that we currently have that don't have some of those certificates. And so we're working on bringing a bunch of those barriers in, and happy to talk about some of these combinations of ways to bring incentives to different levels of certification, and how we can do that between organizations, and how we can use that to inspire people to increase their education in the sport, and what those look like. So love to have those conversations and kind of pitch see where we can work with them.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, I would love to be a part of any of these solutions too. Anything that we're talking about today, you know, it's one thing when we talk about problems, but problems are just problems. Let's make solutions. I'm happy to be a part of that as well. I'm putting that offer out there to Kris, Cody, any committees that you think would help advance these issues for women, people of color in fencing. I would love to be a part of the solution instead of just making, you know, problems and bringing them to light. Ketki and Mallika, to answer your original question about, you know, what we've done on social media and things that we've done that have made an impact on the fencing community. If there's anything that I'm most proud of, it's the survey that Anna Maria Liu conducted last year about sexual assault and sexual harassment in fencing, and my blog published it. You know, we talked to 218 women in that survey, and 60% of them said that they experienced sexual harassment at some point in their fencing career from somebody else in the fencing community. And then 20%, I'm just going to let that number resonate for a second, reported that they themselves had experienced sexual assault. And so, you know, when we published this survey, it actually empowered a lot of women to come forward, report, you know, confide in us as individual members of the fencing coach team that they had experienced these horrific things in the sport of fencing by other fencers. So we believe that this had a direct impact on people coming out, reporting the injustices that they had faced from other people in the fencing community. Now, whether or not they face justice is a whole other issue, but creating that dialogue, amplifying their voices, and these people who had experienced just unbelievably horrible things in their fencing journeys, that's something that I'm proud of for our blog, publishing and sponsoring, and we will continue to speak for women who have been wronged by other fencers in the community and everything that they've had to go through.
Thank you so much, Coach Damien. So our next question is for Coach Anthony. So recently, USA Fencing faced a really unfortunate event on racism, and they released a verdict on that, which was a 2-year ban that was imposed. So do you think this sentence is in line with our no tolerance policy for racism, hate, and bias?
So I'm going to get to that, but there were 2 things that came out right before that I'd just like to make a quick comment on. The first one was, you know, was Damien. And first of all, I think the thing that is really important about social media is giving voice to those things that need to have voice to it. The other part is the question on the coaching. And I would say that I'm really happy that Cody is in the leadership role right now of USFCA, because by him knowing both sides of what happens with USA Fencing as well as the coaching organization, I think this is an opportunity to really make that next level of stride. It's always been very difficult to navigate between those 2 worlds, and I think that there's an opportunity here to move forward. You know, I think the last part of it is, you know, the fact that we just really have to be intentional in all the things that we do. And I think that, you know, when Damien speaks of the survey, I think that that survey is a direct reflection of the culture that preceded that. As where fencing was, it was a male-dominated culture with a certain expectations of social norms, which have moved from that. And that is just one of the things that we have to continue forward. To your question, I believe that, you know, a lot of what we face from the standpoint of our racial issues and the things that are happening are also a product of those cultures. I mean, these are the things that, you know, we are constantly, you know, there are those who deny that there is systemic racism, and there are things that are happening and, you know, that are sometimes they are not necessarily, if you believe racism is a learned behavior and not an inherent behavior, people have learned this behavior excessively and they have learned it very deeply. So now we're in a position now, how do we address this learned behavior? And then also, how do we get it from being a systematic part of what we deal with? So first of all, let me say I was not involved in USA Fencing at the time of that decision. I was no longer in my term. So I won't necessarily comment on the penalty itself, because I can't do that because I'm not privy to the facts of the case. What I can say, though, is that when I look at how that penalty was applied, whether it's the timing or not. What I look for in that is it prescriptive for being able to move the organization forward? And is it appropriate for any individual, if they want to regain membership to our organization, does it have the requirements to make that something that is appropriate? And when I look at the fact that there is an education component required, when I look at the fact that there are community service, you know, and it also depends on how you look at justice. Do you look at justice as punitive, or do you look at it as rehabilitative? And, you know, I look at this penalty as how do you rehabilitate? And then how can you look at that as far as, is this going to allow others to learn from it and to be able to move the cultural change the direction that we need to move it? So that's, you know, from that standpoint, that's pretty much, you know, what I can comment on as far as it was egregious what was said. I mean, the thing that, you know, you have to look at is this something that this human being is just a bad person, or is this a person who's learned bad behavior? And when you see if the person completes the training, if they're acceptable and they're allowed to come back after that, then hopefully that means that that person is being rehabilitated and has served their time to be able to enter society. How long that time is, I'm not going to comment on that, but I'm a firm believer that you don't just kill people and write them off if there's a reason. If they have an opportunity to change their ways, and they prove that. And I see Damien shaking his head because, you know, hey, there are a lot of folks I wouldn't mind killing. I'm sorry, I'll admit that. But as a rule and as a leader and someone who's trying to move the world and the organizations forward, I think that, you know, hey, give them one shot. If they don't make it, then the consequences are appropriate. So that's sort of where I am on that. The most important thing is we have to make sure that people know that this is not acceptable, and we have to move the agenda forward on balancing the racial issues that we have, the sexist issues that we have, and we have to change the culture so that there's an environment where people can be comfortable and move forward.
Thank you so much.
Can I really quickly respond to Don? So I want to make clear, first of all, that this did not happen. This is under the jurisdiction of USA Safe Sport, not US Fencing Safe Sport when this happened. But we're talking about punishment fitting the crime here. And one of the things that did happen during Don's time as president, and again, this has nothing to do with Don or USA Fencing Safe Sport, but we had a coach that was sexually assaulted on an airplane coming back from a NAC. There were eyewitnesses present who attested to her account of what happened. They affirmed everything she said, and the assailant got 1 year perfunctory slap on the wrist. 1 year for this. And if we're gonna increase our diversity of women in fencing and women in coaching, and the message that Safe Sport has given them is saying, if you sexually assault a woman, even if there are people present that say that this happened and they get 1 year for this, what is this message that is being sent to women and coaches? That's disturbing to me. And this is a broader issue with Safe Sport as a whole. But talk about punishment fitting the crime, and I'll get in more about, you know, Boris Waxman later. But when a woman is sexually assaulted and gets a slap on the wrist for, you know, her assailant gets a slap on the wrist, this is a broader problem with how we're approaching Safe Sport and punishment of bad actors in our community as a whole.
And let me just sort of build on that, because, you know, I mean, and that's where, you know, there's one thing for us to be able to do what we do within our goodwill, our intentions, what we can touch. When you start, as Damien's talking about Safe Sport and, you know, infrastructure and things along those lines, that's a very different conversation. And that's one that is, for me personally, is outside of my scope, but it's still one that we have to figure out. And that's a constantly changing landscape. Safe Sport has been an ongoing challenge. And, you know, I don't know where it is now because I'm not as actively involved, but that's an area of improvement. And I think we know that. And the question is, how do we push them and that part of every part of the infrastructure to move forward?
Thank you so much, Coach Damien and Coach Anthony. So what you guys just talked about connects really well to our next question. But before we ask that, is it okay with all of our panelists if we go just a few minutes over instead of 9:30 till 9:45? Second. Okay, so we'll continue with our next question for Natalie. So kind of talking about the message that this spreads. So as a woman of color, do you think that the message sent by the decision on this matter is encouraging to people who face racism? And does it provide people with confidence to speak up about these issues?
Yeah, amazing question. It's funny because I wanted to jump in, but I had the feeling you guys were going to ask me a question next. So I am a believer in transformative justice, and I'll tell you why. But I'll tell you a little bit about my personal story. So I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse until I was 12 years old. And the reason that's important is because I have seen firsthand that when you throw someone away out of one community, they oftentimes continue with their bad behavior, but in a less resourced community. And that happens a lot. And it's really important that within our community, if someone is a bad actor or has bad behavior, we help transform that person. We help them see why it's wrong. Because if not, that behavior is not going to stop. And it's going to continue in a community that's less well-resourced and where the people are potentially less able to take care of themselves, maybe throw them out of their community, etc. Until the behavior spreads, until it gets to more marginalized communities. And so I agree with a lot of what Don was saying. I think that and I agree with Damien. Like honestly, there can't just be a slap in the wrist. Like we have to be serious about this. We have to really look at our role of how we are transforming people, of how we are teaching people. Maybe that person needs to be stripped of all leadership roles. Maybe that person needs to be stripped of all leadership roles. But I don't think, it just instinctively, it does not feel right to have someone, and I'm not speaking just to this case in particular, I'm talking to all cases, I'm talking to all toxic behavior. Like it doesn't make sense to me to throw someone away and then they continue that bad behavior with other people, because that's what happens, and it's not just within this community. I know within like the music, like the conscious music community in California, we saw that happen recently where someone was sexually harassing tons of women and was just like crazy behavior. And, if we throw that person away, they're going to continue with that behavior, right? I don't think that they're going to suddenly change, but within our community, I think that there has to be a way that that person can transform, hopefully. And this is a discussion on transformative justice that's actually like really big, and I'm probably not capable of fully answering the ways and the methods of the way that these things can happen. But I can tell you from my personal experience that that one of the reasons I was abused as a child was because this person was kicked out of one community and no one said anything. They were just kicked out, and then they ended up in my community. And so I can speak to that from personal experience when it comes to like systemically, how are we going to enact transformative justice? How are we going to tell somebody, how are we going? I don't have those answers, and I know that there are people that specialize and dedicate their entire lives to transformative justice, and I applaud those people because that work is so important. But I can tell you that from my experience, I have seen what happens when you throw someone out of one community and then they end up somewhere else where the people are less able, less resourced, and have fewer capacities to deal with that toxic behavior.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So our next question is for Coach Damien. So in your opinion, do you think the DEI programs by USA Fencing are sufficient? And then what can local clubs do to embrace and further these programs?
Hell no, they're not sufficient. Look, and Zinga just said in the comments, and I think it's important to call this out, that there's no way to change a toxic culture where the behavior is allowed, with the caveat that you'll be able to do rehabilitation. And case in point here, diversity inclusion consultant that USA Fencing hired to address this issue walked away because the organization couldn't align on priorities. And I can tell you right now, I've worked in management consulting almost my entire career, and there's something really wrong when a consultant walks away from money. I can tell you that from experience. I think the first thing that we need to do when it comes to diversity and inclusion is do a better job of listening. I'm not talking about hearing fencers of color, I'm talking about listening to them. We need to listen more when one of our most storied athletes in fencing history in Nzinga gets bombarded with racial epithets on a Zoom call, and when she asks for the call to end, we tell her, no, let's keep going, even though you've been called these horrific things. I think there's something terribly wrong when a coach says that Black people are responsible for drugs and crime, and the best they can do is give them 2-year suspension, community service, and force him to make an apology where I guarantee you he's just going to say, I'm sorry I offended you. You know, we talked about coaches. We don't have enough minority coaches, as we discussed today. And I think a good start would be increasing that pipeline, listening more to our disenfranchised athletes and members of the fencing community instead of just telling them everything is fine.
Thank you so much, Coach Damien. Our next question is for Kris. So since you're the CEO of USA Fencing currently, what will you do to ensure that DEI is embraced in decisions throughout USA Fencing? And can you give us some details about current programs and future plans?
Sure. So I think one of the things, and Damien mentioned it earlier, really taking the opportunity to look at solutions and how we're going to move forward. And so I think as an organization, both at the governance and the staff level, really taking a look at our strategy, organizational strategy to become a more diverse and inclusive community. And so I think that involves a lot of things. It is strengthening and aligning our policies. I think it's making sure that we have best practices in place for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and how we hold those best practices and pass them on to the local and grassroots level. I think it's really an opportunity to shift the cultural norms. And I think sport is a reflection of everything that's going on in our society. Fencing is a reflection of everything that's going on in sport. And so it's just a really interesting time in our history and taking the opportunity to shift some of those cultural norms. And so in the short term, what are we doing at the staff and board level to really look at that? First of all, we created the DE&I resource team. And so I think depending on those people who bring some experience and thought and expertise on how we can get better as an organization. We're working to audit and assess all of our manuals and our hiring practices and everything that goes into the organization. Working on our internal and external communication. Are we being reflective of the organization that we want to be? And just taking a look at everything through a DEIB lens and how can we get better as an organization? I think over time, we've done some one-off programs or initiatives, and we've had some success with them. So Bob Bodor in our membership has done some programs where, he's worked with a school in Cleveland to get a program starting. We had outreach from somebody in Alaska who wanted to start a program in one of their native communities. But how do we make that more organizational wide? Don has talked a lot about being intentional, and I think it's not only being intentional, but making it part of the institution moving forward. So I think that there's a lot that we can do both in the short and long term. The one piece that I know that we're all committed to at the staff, at the board, the governance, the committee level is to getting better and to shifting those cultural norms. And I think that's an important point to share with everyone.
Thank you so much, Kris. So our next question is for Coach Cody. So the current USA Fencing Coaching Association, it lacks women and it lacks diversity on the board. So what is the plan to sort of implement DEI at the board level and the USA Fencing Coaching Association?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm working closely on some projects right now to partner hopefully with USA Fencing directly. And one of those changes is also recognizing that when I took over in this role with the Coaching Association, which is kind of looking at the organization structure, which is for most people super boring, looking at bylaws and organizational flow charts. But it's been one of the things that I've done a lot of working with the Olympic Committee as part of the Athlete Advisory Council. And I can tell you that sometimes the reason that certain organizations are not efficient is partly because they don't have the right people involved, and sometimes it's just basically the structure of the organization itself. And so one of the things that I identified in our coaching association is that a lot of the chairs of our lead committees that do the real work, like our certification and accreditation, our professional development, which runs our clinics, those people don't have decision-making authority at the executive committee level. And so, when I think Nzinga was mentioning, it's all about, having people in the right decision-making roles. And so, so in just that philosophy, just looking at, who are the right decision makers and what are they doing, right? If somebody is in charge of certification and one person is in charge of running the clinics, they need to kind of be on the same page of what's going on and being on the decision-making table. In my organization right now, those groups don't have it. So in the meantime, because a lot of these things go through bylaws and changing things, which can be time consuming to get those beginning, I've already started inviting those people to the table. So it's right in the beginning, it's just getting the right people at the table so that their voices are there so you can be heard. And then eventually, so you get voice, and then you get voice and vote. And eventually the goal would be for me to either in USA Fencing or externally to then change it to a smaller, more streamlined structure where the right players doing the right work are all in the decision-making end so that it's all coming together. I can tell you that right now the structure would be that, we already are starting to bring those people together. Right now, the chair of our professional development committee is Vinnie Bradford, woman, and our chair of our certification and accreditation board is Jen Oldham, also a woman. Those two would be part of the executive committee structure of the future organization as I am envisioning it, which would already immediately put 2 women in the executive committee of 5, potentially as a structure moving forward. So those are the kind of visions I have in moving forward, is having the right people and then already having some of those right people in those positions. And then next is just now that you start to see those people in those positions, people start to be inspired. They see the people in the positions of authority and decision making, and then they're going to be able to help kind of create the policies and structural parts of the organization that comes down to how we train, how we certify, how we advertise, and how we get out there to create new mentorship programs and things of that nature. So those are kind of the visions that I have moving forward within that. And then the next part of that is just making sure that our committees and leadership is as transparent. I think sometimes that's as simple as not just putting a list of names on a website, but a name, a picture, and that way if you're looking at a group of people and saying, well, that's a very white group, or there's not a lot of diversity in that community, how can you bring a point of that out? And so I think part of that is recognizing things like diversity inclusion numbers on that. If that's going to be something your organization thinks is important, then you need to put your money where your mouth is, and you need to actually call it out. And when you're failing, you need to say we're failing, but we're working on it. Some of these things take time to do, just how organizations do it. But one of the things that I have mentioned to many people, especially athletes, and a lot of the athlete advocacy I've done, is that some of these major structural changes, they take time. And this is something that I know that I've talked to Nzinga about. I know she aspires to do a lot of change within USA Fencing, and I applaud her for that. I think she'll do great things. But recognize that some of these things we want right now because they're right, and it's the right thing to do. But sometimes it just takes a long time to get through all of those things to get those changes to take hold. And so I would just inspire people that don't give up. These things take time. It can sometimes be a slow and arduous process. Find your allies, figure out what you can do, and be ready to really stay the course. Those changes can happen. I've been working with the Olympic Committee on increasing just general athlete representation, which finally got to 33% for athletes across the Olympic movement. And I had to go through, weekly meetings for over a year with the Olympic Committee to help make those changes happen. But it was well worth it, and I think that will then increase the representation that athletes have in decision making to those same points, and then having those right decision making balances of people of color, gender equity, things of that nature. So I think it's just a matter of taking the time to really have a good thought process, a strategy, and being ready to follow through on it.
Thank you so much, Coach Cody. So we're almost out of time, so we're going to ask our last two questions. So the first one is for Coach Anthony. So college fencing plays a significant role in kind of this equation. So as a head coach for a Division I college fencing program, how can colleges ensure that there's equal opportunities for women?
So I would just say that the first and huge step was Title IX. That has been, what I would say, and it's interesting. Cody will say here sometimes we'll be in sessions and they'll talk about the fact that women at one time just didn't have opportunity in college sports, which killed their careers. They didn't have that ability to use that as a way to get to that next elite level. I think the other thing that's really important is that the scholarships that are available at a Div 1, Div 2 level need to be fully endowed on the women's side. I think in the Div 1 side, it's usually done because of the balance between Title IX maintaining, but at the Div 2 level, they don't have that many scholarships in the first place. I think the more we can get in that area helps to allow women, especially those who don't come from economically advantaged backgrounds, to continue their careers. For me personally, one of the things that I'm looking at is how can we get fencing into historical Black colleges and universities, because I think that that would be another way to be able to continue both people of diversity, people of color, as well as women to be able to continue to fence. And then I think that last piece goes back to what I was saying. More female coaches means that women will feel more comfortable coming and creating a culture where women feel comfortable in that particular fencing program, where it's a environment where they are comfortable, they're respected, and they're allowed to flourish and achieve, and then really recruiting to get them in there.
Thank you so much, Coach Anthony. So our last question is for Natalie. So what do you think are good ways of creating safe spaces to discuss women's health and related issues that are unique to women fencers?
I love that question because I emailed you guys about that. Well, first of all, I just want to address what we've been talking about. I think it's absolutely important that we see diversity in our leaders as a value in itself. It's not just about inclusion. It's also about looking at who our leaders are, and when we really see diversity as a value in itself, I think that we can begin to change our way of seeing this. So there are women's fencers. We deal with some really unique issues, and it's really interesting to me. I've had to figure out a lot on my own or talk to athletes, but there are unique things that women fencers and women athletes deal with. We deal with how do you deal with periods or cramping on the strip? How do you deal with your cycle? How do you deal? I mean, there's so many issues that honestly, I probably wouldn't go to most of my male coaches to talk to about this, but I would go to other female athletes, especially when I first started competing and doing the first few world tours. There were quite a few women that were older than me, and I would ask them a bunch of questions. How do you deal with your cycle? How do you, what if you're in the middle of a bout and you start bleeding, you get your period comes and you need to take a break. How do you deal with that? Because right now it's an injury break. Even if you tell the referee it's some kind of an injury break. And so how do we deal with that? Because we really do have some things that are unique to women in fencing that are not unique to men's fencing. Did I answer the question? I actually have I also want to challenge everyone here. I don't think that you need a robust program like the Peter Westbrook Foundation to start enacting some small things that will increase accessibility at a very grassroots level to fencers. One of the things that I do is I teach different clinics and camps and winter camps, and I'll go to different cities that might not have like huge programs. Like I'll go to Oklahoma City. I teach in Phoenix, my hometown, a lot, and I always put aside at least 2 scholarships. And oftentimes, if it's not my club or a club that I know, I ask the coach, to kind of identify who needs those scholarships. And I think that that is something really small, that barrier, the financial barrier, comes down to some of those athletes. I know that I have benefited from that, and that's why it's really important that when I'm coaching or doing a clinic anywhere, that I give that opportunity to other fencers. The other thing is I'd like to see fencing in more communities of color, because, you know, it's like finances and transportation. That's like, whenever you make a decision, you always think about that. Like, how far is it and how much does it cost, right? No matter who you are, how much money you have, like, it doesn't matter. Like, how much does it cost and how far is it? Like, that's something you always ask yourself, right? And so I think that that's, you know, that's another thing that I would like to see. I would like to see fencing in more communities of color. I know that where my fencing club, where I'm from in Phoenix, it's a predominantly Hispanic community, and that's probably why we have more Latino fencers than pretty much any other fencing club I have ever seen. And so I challenge everyone to kind of take those small steps, maybe starting satellite clubs, maybe going to a school a school or even a reservation. I know in the Portland area, Cody, if you want, I know through my connections, I'm sure I could link you with some, like, there are lots of like native reservations like in and around the Portland area that I'm sure would so love fencing. You know, how can we get fencing in these areas? And that, you know, and then the barriers to accessibility, like, kind of, it just makes it easier for everyone. Yeah, I hope I answered your question, but I had so much floating in the air from this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. We really enjoyed discussing these issues, and we hope to progress more in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good. Well done. Very well done. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Right, if we could make sure
You guys, good seeing everybody on here too.
Panelists, if we could have you guys, because we want to get a quick picture with you guys too. So
Sure.
we'd love to have that opportunity. So that way, have everyone there. So quick little hello from everyone. Say a quick hi. So, just as I'm coming back on up here, thank you again for Ketki and Mallika, doing a fantastic job there. We also wanted to, something that's also near and dear for me is that the referees commission that Tasha Basant has been voted as a person who's the chair. So that's an important thing. That is another woman right there who is taking on the referees commission, which is great. And also that there is another group, I'm myself involved with the Western Fencing Conference, whose job is, our goal is developing more fencing programs in the West region. So obviously by doing that increases more fencers throughout the area. So anyway, panelists, thank you again for everything that you have done, for your valuable insights and everything else like that. Thank you very much. So Ketki and Mallika, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, that's it. Thank you so much for attending our panel. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great weekend.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Ketki and Mallika.
Bye. Thank you for attending.
Sí.
¿Qué se